The day I found out my neighbors were planning to move my house, I honestly thought somebody was playing a joke on me. Not remodel it, not inspect it, not work around it, move it. Physically rotate my entire cabin on the mountainside like it was a lawn chair sitting on a patio. Looking back now, that should have been the moment I realized just how disconnected from reality some people can become when they've spent too many years believing money solves every problem. My name is Owen Mercer, and for almost 12 years I lived on a piece of land outside a small mountain community called Silver Ridge. It wasn't fancy. Nobody would have confused my cabin with the luxury homes that started showing up in the area over the last decade. But every beam, every support post, every retaining wall on that property carried a story. I built most of it myself with help from my father before he passed away. The cabin sat on nearly 9 acres of steep hillside forest, surrounded by pine trees and granite outcroppings. The land wasn't easy to work with. In fact, most people considered it a terrible place to build. The slope was aggressive, the access road was narrow, and the weather could turn ugly without warning. But there was one natural shelf of stable ground halfway up the hill, and that's where I built my home. We anchored the foundation directly into bedrock. We spent months reinforcing everything because the terrain demanded it. By the time it was finished, that cabin wasn't just a structure. It felt like part of the mountain itself. For years, life was simple. I traveled occasionally for consulting work, spent my weekends maintaining trails on the property, and enjoyed the kind of peace that becomes rare once you're over 40 and tired of unnecessary drama. Then the vacant lot next door sold. At first, I didn't think much about it. Lots changed hands all the time. Most people bought mountain property because they wanted privacy. Usually that meant fewer interactions, not more. Then I met Grant and Vanessa Holloway. They arrived in matching SUVs that probably cost more than my entire cabin. Within a week, they had survey crews, architects, engineers, and drone operators all over their property. Every conversation somehow turned into a presentation about their future plans. They weren't building a home. They were building what Grant repeatedly called a destination experience. I still remember the first time he used that phrase. We were standing near the property line while he pointed across the valley. "Can you imagine waking up to that view every morning?" he asked. I looked where he was pointing. It was the same view I'd been waking up to for over a decade. "Yeah," I said. "I can imagine it pretty well." He laughed. I wasn't joking. A few weeks later, I noticed a drone hovering over my cabin while I was stacking firewood. It wasn't even trying to be discreet. The thing was practically looking through my windows. I followed it back to the property line where Grant stood holding a controller. "You mind keeping that thing over your own land?" I asked. He flashed a smile that immediately rubbed me the wrong way. It wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was the kind of smile people use when they've already decided they're smarter than everyone else in the room. "Just scouting terrain," he said. "No harm done. Maybe I should have pushed harder right then. Maybe I should have recognized the warning signs. But I figured we were adults. We had property boundaries. Surely that would be enough." About a month later, I left town for a 5-day consulting trip in Denver. It was routine work. Nothing unusual. I flew out on a Monday morning and expected to be home by Friday afternoon. Instead, Friday became the day my quiet little mountain life exploded. The moment I turned onto my access road, I knew something was wrong. Heavy equipment lined the driveway. Construction trucks were parked where they had absolutely no business being. Bright orange paint covered sections of ground around my cabin. My stomach dropped before I even got out of the truck. Then I saw the steel structure. Massive beams had been assembled beside my home. Hydraulic equipment sat nearby. Workers moved around carrying tools and checking measurements. It looked less like a construction project and more like preparations for some bizarre military operation. I parked, stepped out, and walked directly toward the nearest foreman. "What's going on here?" I asked. He glanced at a clipboard and answered so casually it almost sounded rehearsed. "We're preparing for the cabin relocation." I stared at him. "The what?" He pointed toward my house. "We're rotating the structure approximately 12 degrees clockwise to improve sight lines for the neighboring development." For a few seconds I genuinely thought I had misheard him. Then reality settled in. They weren't confused. They weren't joking. These people actually intended to move my house. And standing there in my own driveway, looking at a steel lifting system rising beside the cabin my father helped me build, I realized this situation was about to become a whole lot bigger than a bad neighbor dispute. I asked the foreman to repeat himself because there was no way my brain was processing what I had just heard. He looked almost uncomfortable the second time. The neighboring property owners contracted a structural relocation company. We're scheduled to rotate the cabin 12 degrees. According to the project documents, it improves the visual corridor for the main lodge. Visual corridor. That's what they called it. Not my home. Not private property. Not a place where a man had spent 12 years of his life. A visual corridor. I walked away before I said something that would have gotten me arrested and immediately called Grant. He answered on the second ring like he'd been expecting the call. Owen, he said cheerfully. Welcome back. I could hear people talking in the background and glasses clinking somewhere. It sounded like he was celebrating something. Tell me why there are contractors next to my house. There was a brief pause. Then he sighed dramatically. I was hoping our development manager would have explained everything. Explained what? The adjustment. I remember gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. What adjustment? Your cabin orientation. He said it exactly like that. Cabin orientation. Like we were discussing furniture placement. Grant, that's my house. And it's unfortunately positioned in a way that blocks part of the eastern sunrise view from our main lodge. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was so ridiculous my brain didn't know what else to do. You think you can move my house because you don't like the view? It's not that simple, he replied. We've invested several $1 million into this development. The design benefits the entire community. Increased tourism. Higher property values. More economic activity. You're out of your mind. It's only 12 degrees. I still remember that sentence. It's only 12 degrees. Like the size of the theft somehow mattered less than the fact it was theft. I hung up before I completely lost my temper and started taking pictures of everything. Every truck. Every stake. Every beam. Every inch of equipment touching my property. Then I drove straight into town and called the one person I trusted when things got complicated. Her name was Rebecca Lawson. I'd known Rebecca for years. She was one of those attorneys who didn't waste words and didn't care how much money somebody had. When I spread the photographs across her conference table, she spent several minutes looking at them without speaking. Then she removed her glasses and stared at me. Tell me this is a misunderstanding. I wish it was. She asked for surveys, deeds, easements, permits, property records, everything. We spent the next 3 hours reviewing documents. The deeper she dug, the more irritated she became. By late afternoon, she had stacks of papers spread across her desk. Okay, she said finally. Here's what we're dealing with. She started counting on her fingers. Trespassing. Structural interference. Property endangerment. Unauthorized access. Potential civil damages. Potential criminal liability. And depending on how far they intended to go, attempted unlawful seizure of real property interests. So they're in trouble? I asked. Rebecca leaned back. Owen, they're not in trouble yet. They're about to become trouble. That evening she drafted an emergency cease and desist notice and sent copies to everyone involved. Grant. Vanessa. Their development company. Their contractors. Their engineering consultants. Anyone whose name appeared on the paperwork. The response arrived the following morning. It came from a law firm in Los Angeles. A very expensive law firm judging by the letterhead. Their argument was so absurd I initially thought it was satire. They claimed the proposed repositioning would improve overall neighborhood aesthetics. They argued the modification would create mutual economic benefit. Then they suggested I participate cooperatively in the process and share a portion of the relocation expenses. I read that sentence 3 times. They wanted me to help pay for moving my own house against my will. Rebecca looked at me and shook her head. I've practiced law for 22 years, she said. This is one of the dumbest things I've ever read. The next morning she filed for emergency injunctive relief. Things moved quickly after that. Apparently judges don't appreciate people attempting unauthorized structural relocation projects on someone else's property. The hearing took place 4 days later. Grant showed up wearing an expensive suit and the expression of a man who genuinely believed the rules would bend for him. Vanessa sat beside him looking annoyed rather than worried. Rebecca arrived carrying enough evidence to fill a small library. Survey maps, drone images, property records, construction photos, equipment logs, witness statements. The hearing itself lasted less than an hour. Judge Nathan Whitaker reviewed the photographs in silence. At one point he zoomed in on an image showing the lifting framework positioned beside my cabin. He stared at it for several seconds. Then he looked at Grant's attorney. Your clients intended to reposition a privately owned residential structure? The attorney launched into a speech about community enhancement and development interests. The judge held up one hand. Did they have permission? Silence. Did they possess any legal authority? More silence. The judge nodded slowly. That's what I thought. A few minutes later he issued the order. Every piece of equipment had to be removed. All activity within 100 feet of my cabin had to stop. The property had to be restored. Compliance period, 14 days. Then came the part that mattered most. If the defendants failed to comply, I would be authorized to remove the equipment and recover costs. Outside the courthouse, Grant intercepted me near the parking lot. You're making a mistake, he said. Am I? You don't understand the scale of what we're building. I understand perfectly. His smile disappeared for the first time since I'd met him. This isn't over. No, I said. It isn't. The next 2 weeks became a strange waiting game. Every morning I drove past the site expecting to see workers dismantling equipment. Nothing happened. Day 1. Nothing. Day 5. Nothing. Day 10. Nothing. The lifting framework remained exactly where it was. Trucks came and went. Construction continued elsewhere on their property. It was almost like Grant had convinced himself the court order didn't apply to him. Rebecca wasn't surprised. Some people spend so much time getting their way. She said, they stop recognizing consequences when they finally arrive. On the evening of day 14, she called me. Ready for tomorrow? I looked out the cabin window toward the steel structure sitting beside my home. The setting sun reflected off the metal. For a moment it looked almost beautiful. Then I remembered why it was there. More than ready. She laughed. Good. Because I've already arranged the demolition contractors. I didn't sleep much that night. Part of me still expected Grant to come to his senses, to show up with trucks and workers and start removing everything before sunrise. But deep down I knew better. Men like Grant rarely back down until reality physically forces them to. And as dawn approached on the 15th day, reality was finally pulling into my driveway. The sun had barely cleared the ridgeline when the first trucks arrived. Then came the excavators, the welders, the hauling crews, and a deputy from the county sheriff's office who had already reviewed every page of Judge Whitaker's order. Rebecca stepped out of her truck carrying a coffee and a folder, looking calmer than someone about to oversee the legal destruction of a 6-figure construction setup. Morning, she said. Beautiful day for compliance. I laughed for the first time in weeks. Then the work started. The welders cut through the steel framework section by section. Sparks flew across the damp morning air while excavators pulled support beams loose and loaded them onto flatbeds. Ground anchors disappeared one after another. Equipment parked on my property was chained up and removed. Every hour the structure looked smaller. Every hour my cabin looked more like itself again. By noon, the giant lifting rig that had towered beside my home for weeks was nothing more than twisted steel stacked on trailers waiting to leave. Around 1 in the afternoon, 2 black SUVs came flying up the road. The moment I saw them, I knew exactly who had arrived. Grant jumped out before the vehicle stopped moving. Vanessa followed close behind. His face was red. Not embarrassed red. Furious red. The kind of red that comes from finally discovering the world doesn't revolve around you. What the hell is this? He shouted. One of the deputies calmly pointed toward the court order. Grant ignored him and stormed toward me. You destroyed our property. I took the folded copy of the order from my jacket and handed it to him. No, I said. You left your property on my land after a judge ordered you to remove it. He looked at Rebecca. You can't seriously think this is legal. Rebecca smiled politely. Actually, it's one of the most legal things I've ever participated in. For a moment I thought Grant might explode. Instead, he stood there staring at the empty patch of ground where his grand plan had once stood. The mountain was quiet except for diesel engines and workers loading the final pieces of steel. It was almost poetic. Weeks earlier he'd looked at my cabin and seen an obstacle. Now he was looking at the consequences of treating another person's home like a problem to be solved. By late afternoon, the last truck rolled away. The entire site was clear. Tire tracks remained in the dirt, but everything else was gone. My cabin stood exactly where it had always stood. Same foundation. Same view. Same 12-year history rooted into the mountainside. You'd think that would have been the end of it. It wasn't. About 2 months later, Grant filed a lawsuit seeking $120,000 in alleged damages related to project delays. According to his filing, My actions had interfered with development schedules and caused financial harm. When Rebecca called to tell me, I laughed so hard I nearly spilled coffee across my kitchen counter. The hearing was even shorter than the first one. Grant's attorney barely finished explaining the claim before Judge Whitaker started asking questions. Questions like why court-ordered compliance costs should somehow become my responsibility. Questions like why equipment had remained on my property after a direct judicial order. Questions Grant's legal team clearly didn't want to answer. Eventually, the judge leaned back in his chair and said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. The plaintiff's financial losses appear to be the direct result of his own decisions. Then he dismissed the case. Just like that. Gone. When we walked outside the courthouse, Rebecca looked at me and said, "You know, most people spend their entire careers without seeing a lawsuit self-destruct this efficiently." We both laughed. I haven't spoken to Grant since. The luxury lodge project eventually scaled back. Whether it was because of legal costs, delays, investor concerns, or pure embarrassment, I honestly don't know. What I do know is this: my cabin is still there. Every morning the sun rises over the same mountains. Every evening the wind moves through the same pine trees my father and I worked beside all those years ago. And every now and then, when I'm sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, I think about how close someone came to believing they could literally reposition another person's life for a better view. Maybe that's the lesson in all of this. Some people become so focused on what they want that they stop seeing the line between ambition and entitlement. They convince themselves that if an obstacle is inconvenient enough, it shouldn't exist. The problem is that sometimes the obstacle is a human being, a family, a home, or a piece of land that doesn't belong to them. And when that line finally gets enforced, it feels unfair only to the person who spent years pretending it wasn't there. But here's what I'd love to know from you guys. If you were in my position, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have gone straight to court, or would you have tried to negotiate first? And after everything Grant did, do you think he deserved every consequence that followed, or do you think tearing down the entire setup went too far? Let me know down in the comments because I've seen people argue both sides of this story, and honestly, the debate is almost as interesting as what actually happened.